What if the man you humiliated on a dusty construction site turned out to own the entire company? What if the bricklayer you dismissed with a laugh was the CEO who built everything you stand on? This is the true story of arrogance, silence, and a hidden identity that would shake the foundations of an entire industry. When engineer Ethan Cole insulted a black construction worker in front of a crowd, he thought he was putting a laborer in his place. But what he didn't know was that Marcus Bradley wasn't just any worker. He was the billionaire founder of Titan Core Developments. And in less than 48 hours, roles would reverse reputations, would collapse, and a new future would be built. One not made of concrete, but of respect. This is not just a story of justice, it's the story of redemption. Second chances and the power of rebuilding. Not just structures, but people. Stay with us. Because by the end of this story, you'll never look at a bricklayer the same way again. The morning heat in Atlanta had already begun to press down, like a thick invisible weight on the shoulders of every man and woman at the Titan Core Development site, a sprawling multi-million-dollar corporate construction project nestled near the city's rising tech district, where steel skeletons reached upward like unfinished prayers. Amid the clanging of metal, the hiss of welding torches, and the rhythmic slam of rebar into foundation, forms a gathering had begun near the mobile command unit, a hastily arranged morning briefing that pulled in engineers in clean polos, supervisors with clipboards and a few senior laborers among them, Marcus Bradley. Marcus, dressed in a worn gray work shirt with his name stitched crookedly above the chest pocket, stood quietly near the back of the group. The years had lined his face and thickened his hands, but he carried himself with a calm, unshakable air like concrete cured slow and strong. A third-generation brick mason and site manager, Marcus had been working in construction since he was 19, and his instincts about the land and the weight of a building's bones were as reliable as any sensor or formula. Today he had stepped into the meeting reluctantly but firmly, holding a set of marked-up blueprints he'd spent the previous night reviewing after something about the Northeast Foundation. Layout hadn't sat right with him. The slope on that side of the site, subtle but undeniable, meant that the load distribution would be uneven unless adjusted, and any experienced builder would see the risk of structural stress fractures emerging within a year of completion. Yet the moment Marcus raised his voice steady, respectful but firm to point this out, the energy in the air shifted. Ethan Cole, the newly hired lead structural engineer, turned his head sharply, his jaw tightening as if someone had insulted his credentials. Clad in a tailored blazer, crisp blue shirt without a wrinkle, and shiny black Italian shoes utterly impractical for a site visit, Ethan was the kind of man who measured respect in degrees earned and titles printed. He stepped forward, waving a dismissive hand before Marcus could finish his point. "Can you please be quiet?" Ethan said, his voice smooth but laced with disdain, and let the professionals speak. The words landed like a slap sharp, humiliating and public. All around conversations halted. Even the machines seemed to hush, as though the insult had silenced the very pulse of the site. The sting of condescension rippled through the crowd, and for a heartbeat, nobody moved. "We don't pay bricklayers to think." Ethan continued, pacing casually in front of the group, like a professor delivering a lecture to underachieving students. Just to follow instructions, his gaze flicked toward Marcus as if to say, "You're lucky to even be standing here." Murmurs fluttered across the gathered crowd. Some of the younger engineers chuckled awkwardly. A few of the site workers, black, Hispanic, white, shifted uncomfortably, their boots scuffing against the gravel, unsure whether to look away in sympathy or hide their own relief that they weren't the target. Marcus, however, didn't move. He simply stood, holding the blueprint steady, his lips pressed into a tight, unreadable line. Behind his eyes flickered something ancient. Not rage, not even sadness, but the steady, cold recognition of what this moment really was. Another man with power, assuming that titles made him smarter than time, tested wisdom, that whiteness and education eclipsed experience born from sweat failure and decades of hands-on mastery. Ethan, either emboldened by the crowd's silence or too arrogant to notice the tension, turned fully toward Marcus now, and added with a smirk designed to entertain his fellow elites, "Honestly, maybe we should just hand you a diploma. Clearly you understand foundational physics better than my colleagues at MIT." The sarcasm stung sharper than a whip. Laughter, forced and uneasy, rippled from a few engineers. One of them, a young intern with nervous eyes, looked at Marcus, then quickly looked down, cheeks flushed with shame. Marcus raised his eyes and met Ethan's stare. "With all due respect, sir," he said again, slower this time, voice even but quietly resolute. "I believe you missed how the elevation slope in Quadrant 3 will cause differential stress under weight load. It's not personal, it's physics." Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically and turned his back. "Let's not waste time. We've got deadlines. I need everyone focused on execution, not theory from the help." That word, the help, hung in the air like acid rain. Marcus slowly lowered his blueprint. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, he didn't walk out or throw anything. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression unreadable. If you weren't watching closely, you might think he had been defeated, that he had accepted the pecking order and tucked his pride into his pocket like loose change. But those who knew Marcus really knew him might have noticed the flicker in his eyes. It wasn't rage, it was a calculation. A cold surgical awareness, as if he'd just made a mental note, flipped an invisible switch and began a countdown. Ethan, satisfied with his victory, continued with the meeting, gesturing toward his tablet, outlining cost-saving measures that conveniently aligned with the safety compromises Marcus had just tried to warn against. No one interrupted him again. No one dared. And no one noticed when Marcus, without a word, stepped back from the crowd, pulled out his cracked and battered phone, typed a single sentence, and hit send. There was no dramatic music, no gasp from the crowd. Just one man overlooked, underestimated, and disrespected, quietly initiating the first domino in a sequence that would change the fate of this entire project. This company and the man who thought authority gave him the right to humiliate others. As the morning sun climbed higher over Atlanta, casting shadows that stretched like fingers across the unfinished walls and the exposed concrete of the site, no one realized they had just witnessed the first fracture, not in the building's foundation, but in the illusion of superiority Ethan Cole had built around himself. And that fracture, unlike the one Marcus had warned them about, was already spreading. The sun continued its quiet ascent over Atlanta, indifferent to the brewing storm beneath it, as the Titan Core development site settled back into the rhythm of machinery and orders. Yet something beneath the surface had shifted irrevocably. Marcus Bradley returned to his designated area near the mixing station, where piles of crushed stone and sacks of Portland cement towered like silent witnesses to a confrontation that few dared to acknowledge and fewer still dared to question. As he donned his protective gloves and lifted a hose to moisten the mixture, his movements were calm, precise, almost meditative, yet inside a fire simmered not of vengeance but of resolve, tempered by decades of restraint and clarity. The message he had sent minutes earlier was simple but decisive, directed to a private number stored under the contact name TB Admin only, a number that few knew existed and even fewer were authorized to use. Its contents read, "Only northeast flaw, confirmed, phase trigger, ready request, an owner-level field audit, urgent across town, behind the reflective glass of a nondescript executive building nestled in the Midtown district." That message lit up on a private encrypted device resting beside a polished mahogany desk, where a woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed and sharp-eyed, read it and immediately stood up without finishing her espresso. She made a call that bypassed 3 levels of protocol and alerted a logistics team whose job was not only to protect, but to transform. Back at the site, Ethan Cole remained oblivious to the ripple effect his arrogance had set in motion. He strutted across the scaffold perimeter with a swagger that belied his growing insecurities born not from self-doubt, but from an obsessive need to assert dominance in spaces he believed belonged to his kind men. With degrees from elite institutions, pressed suits, and names that opened doors. He was still laughing about his exchange with Marcus as he approached the upper mezzanine, where 2 younger engineers were discussing load-bearing tolerances using software projections. "Gentlemen," Ethan said, interrupting them, mid-sentence, "next time you see our resident philosopher bricklayer, make sure he doesn't mix his cement with ego." One of the engineers gave a half-hearted chuckle, but the other, a Haitian-born graduate who had worked his way through night classes while supporting 2 siblings, simply nodded without humor, his eyes betraying unease. Meanwhile, Marcus remained silent, completing his duties with the same diligence he had shown every day since the project's inception. Yet those who observed closely might have noticed that he wasn't just working, he was watching. He noticed every shifted crane position, every load drop near the quadrant he'd warned about. And more importantly, he watched Ethan noting the man's growing tendency to favor optics over safety, shortcuts over protocol, By late morning, a buzz began to build across the site. An SUV caravan was approaching, not the usual inspection team, but blacked-out government-grade vehicles escorted by two city cruisers. It was a presence that made foremen stand straighter and project managers check their earpieces twice. "Who the hell is arriving like the president?" one worker muttered near the steel support cages. "You think it's OSHA?" another whispered. But those who had worked longer in the industry knew better. Titan Corps' founder, Marcus Thomas Bradley, known to most simply as Mr. T, was a ghost in the system rarely seen. Almost mythic, rumored to appear only when a project faced potential catastrophe or transformation. The rumor was confirmed within minutes when word reached Ethan through his Bluetooth headset. Emergency site review requested by the company owner. Be at the mobile HQ in 15 minutes. Ethan froze, the color draining from his face. The owner? "I thought he was overseas," he said to his assistant, who simply shrugged, equally confused. Panic rose like bile in Ethan's throat as he glanced around at the unpolished site, the incomplete scaffolds, and the lack of cleanup along the southern perimeter. "Get the crew to make this place look presentable now," he barked, voice-tight, posture rigid. But amid the chaos of the hasty polish-up, no one noticed Marcus step quietly into the far end of the administrative trailer, where he removed his helmet and exchanged his dust-covered outerwear for a pressed white dress shirt, an embroidered tie clip bearing the Titan Corps emblem, and a pair of dark rimless glasses that, together with his calm composure, transformed him from invisible worker to unshakable executive. As he looked into the small mirror fixed inside the trailer locker, he didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply nodded once to himself, to the role he was about to reclaim, to the truth that could no longer remain hidden. 15 minutes later, the site came to a hush as a gleaming black Mercedes sedan pulled up to the central access point. From the passenger side emerged a security officer in a tactical suit, scanning the perimeter before opening the rear door. Ethan approached with a rehearsed smile, hand extended in greeting nerves, masked behind the facade of corporate confidence. But when Marcus stepped out now, clean-shaven, dressed in tailored charcoal, with the bearing of someone who belonged not to the construction site, but to the boardroom, overseeing it, Ethan's smile faltered. The silence around them thickened as realization set in, across the faces of supervisors, interns, laborers, each person placing the pieces together. Ethan blinked rapidly. I'm sorry. We were expecting Mr. Marcus Bradley, the owner," he stammered. Marcus turned to face him fully and said without raising his voice, "You were—" The weight of those two words collapsed, whatever illusion of power Ethan had left. "You mean, you're the—" Ethan couldn't finish the sentence, his mind grasping desperately for a reality in which he hadn't just mocked, insulted, and publicly humiliated the very man who now held his fate in his hand. Marcus extended his hand not to shake, but to reclaim space. Marcus Thomas Bradley, owner, founder. And this morning, the man you told to shut up and let the professionals speak. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous, a mix of gasps, hushed murmurs, and stunned silence. Workers who had once looked at Marcus as a peer now saw the quiet authority he had always carried, now fully revealed. Engineers who had laughed nervously before now turned pale, exchanging glances as though watching a train wreck unfold in slow motion. But Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't rage. Instead, he walked past Ethan into the administrative trailer, where a scheduled site briefing was about to become an inquisition. Ethan followed like a man chasing a verdict he hoped to rewrite. Inside, blueprints were unrolled, spreadsheets projected, and recordings. Played recordings of Ethan's voice mocking Marcus's warning, dismissing safety concerns, and overriding junior engineers who had dared to raise objections. "You said this morning," Marcus began, his tone clinical, "that we don't pay bricklayers to think." He tapped on the screen where audio captured Ethan's exact phrasing. "But our employee manual, page 12, section 3, states clearly that any member of the team, regardless of rank or role, has an ethical obligation to report structural concerns." He turned to the senior auditor beside him, who stood and read off 17 violations discovered during the 2-hour audit triggered by Marcus's alert. Ethan swallowed, hard sweat beading along his hairline. I can explain," he said, voice cracking. "The decision to approve cheaper materials was part of the cost-saving initiative for which you approved bonuses. Marcus countered, producing a digital invoice showing performance incentives tied to those very cuts. Then, with a slow pivot, he faced the group and said, "Let's be clear. If you had listened to the concerns of the man you assume was beneath you, you would have impressed the owner of this company with your humility. Instead, you revealed your weakness masked as ego, your prejudice masquerading as hierarchy." The room fell into stunned silence. Outside, a crowd of workers had gathered, unaware that the next chapter in their company's legacy was being written in real time, in real words, by the man they had worked beside for weeks, not realizing he was the very architect of their futures. And in the center of it all, Ethan Cole, once so confident in the untouchable armor of pedigree and position, now stood exposed, stripped of pretense, face to face with the weight of his own misjudgment. As the tension inside the administrative trailer settled into a leaden silence, Ethan Cole stood like a monument to implosion, his shoulders sagging under the weight of revelation, sweat soaking the collar of his tailored shirt as if it were the concrete foundation cracking under pressure, just as Marcus Bradley had predicted hours before. He could barely bring himself to look at the faces of the other engineers, men and women he had once commanded with a smug flick of the wrist. Now all avoiding his gaze, some, ashamed, others, quietly relieved that the reckoning had not arrived for them. Marcus, standing tall at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the blueprints projected onto the wall behind him, adjusted his glasses with deliberate calm and said, "Let's discuss the Northeast foundations." He tapped the screen and brought up a close-range drone image taken only 2 days prior. The magnified photo revealed micro cracks, thin, pale stress lines already forming in the freshly poured concrete at the exact quadrant Marcus had warned about. This, Marcus continued his voice, neither angry nor raised, is the result of ignoring terrain slope and differential weight distribution. It's not theory, it's not ego, it's physics, and it's proof. One of the junior engineers, pale-faced, visibly trembling, rose from his seat and finally spoke. "Mr. Bradley, sir, we noticed the early stress, but Mr. Cole insisted that our original calculations held. When we tried to run the new load projections, The engineer trailed off. Marcus turned toward him, gently, not to accuse, but to invite honesty. "He what?" The young man swallowed. "He deleted our simulation data and threatened to write us up for challenging his authority." A soft gasp escaped from one of the other project managers, and suddenly a wave of confessions followed. Another engineer stood and admitted they had been pushed to ignore rebar density protocols. A materials inspector revealed that Ethan had approved a concrete supplier with an unverified batch rating to shave off $20,000 in overhead. Piece by piece, the polished illusion Ethan had built collapsed like a badly measured retaining wall. "This is a conspiracy," Ethan barked suddenly, his voice rising in desperation, his face twisted in disbelief. "A coordinated attack against my position, against my credentials. I am a respected structural engineer with a master's from Stanford. I've led 10 projects across 4 states. And yet, you couldn't see the foundation cracking under your feet," Marcus interrupted, voice like a scalpel, clean, precise, devastating. "You mocked a warning, you silenced your team, and you gambled safety for bonuses." The last word hit hardest. A murmur ran through the room. "Bonuses," someone echoed. Marcus motioned to Harold King, Titan Corps' senior operations director, who stepped forward with a manila folder, incentive agreements tied to cost reduction benchmarks. Harold explained, if the project came in under budget by $1 million, select managers, including Mr. Cole, stood to receive substantial compensation. Ethan's face turned a sickly shade of white. He opened the folder handed to him with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a termination letter, effective immediately, citing negligence, falsification of records, and violation of internal ethics code. The second, a voluntary resignation agreement with a unique addendum. "You have 2 options," Marcus said, stepping closer, lowering his voice just enough so that the room leaned in. "Option 1, termination for cause, followed by civil proceedings and likely revocation of your license." Ethan blinked rapidly, chest heaving, or he croaked. "Option 2, Marcus continued, you resign voluntarily. In exchange, you return all bonuses and commit to 6 months of unpaid training. Work for our foundation program, teaching construction. Fundamentals and ethics to disadvantaged youth communities across Atlanta." For a long time, no one said anything. Not the engineers, not the interns, not the assistants standing along the wall. Even the hum of the HVAC seemed to hold its breath. Ethan looked around the room, once filled with allies, now surrounded by professionals who had seen through the mask. I need time to think, he muttered. 5 minutes, Marcus replied, simply, then turned to the rest of the group. In the meantime, gather all staff and workers in the courtyard. They deserve transparency. A few engineers moved instantly glad for something to do, while others lingered watching Ethan with something between pity and horror. Left alone by the table, Ethan sat heavily in a metal chair, his mind spinning as if trying to reassemble a tower already imploded. Outside, the workers gathered: bricklayers, crane operators, junior staff, the cleanup crew, all drawn by the buzz of something monumental unfolding. Marcus stepped onto the portable platform, set up near the southern wing, the structure framed by steel rebar columns that had not yet been poured. The crowd went silent as his voice rang out, calm, confident, clear. Good afternoon. My name is Marcus Thomas Bradley. Some of you may know me as Marcus the bricklayer, who joined the crew 2 months ago. Today I stand before you not just as a worker, but as the founder of Titan Core Developments. A collective wave of realization passed over the workers, like a breeze through scaffolding. Some gasped, others nodded, the truth clicking into place. I've walked this site beside you. Marcus continued sweating under the same sun, hearing the same orders, experiencing the same silences. And this morning, I was told to shut up, to let the professionals speak. His voice didn't rise, but it resonated deeper than any loudspeaker could. But being a professional isn't about degrees or designer shoes. It's about integrity and courage and the willingness to listen, especially when the warning comes from someone you overlooked. The workers stood stunned. Many of them had seen Ethan's behavior, had endured smaller insults, brushed off ideas, and subtle jokes that echoed the same superiority he had tried to enforce that morning. As of today, Marcus said, his voice steady as a poured footer, Ethan Cole is no longer part of Titan Core. Applause erupted, not wild or mocking, but resolute, thunderous, united. Marcus raised a hand and the noise fell to silence. But this is not just about one man, it's about all of us. We do not build buildings here, we build respect. And if we don't lay that foundation first, nothing we build will ever last. Behind him, the door of the trailer opened and Ethan stepped out, his eyes hollow, carrying a box of his belongings. He walked past the assembled crew, each step a mile long, his name now echoing only in pity, not power. There were no jeers, no boos, just silence, and perhaps that for Ethan was worse. And as he passed Marcus, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest glimmer of understanding. A spark that signaled the story of destruction had perhaps just begun its pivot into something else, a story of transformation. As the dust settled in the courtyard and the echo of applause faded into the humming air of late afternoon, Marcus Bradley stepped down from the makeshift platform with the steady grace of a man who had long carried the weight of two worlds, one in which he had been underestimated and one in which he now held absolute authority, not only by title but by truth. Workers slowly returned to their duties with a new energy, a rare kind of quiet electricity that only comes after a shift in gravity when the ground beneath you has changed, but somehow feels more solid. Meanwhile, inside the executive trailer, Ethan Cole sat slumped in a corner chair, his box of belongings beside him, untouched. The termination papers lay on the table, unsigned. He stared at them blankly as though the words had blurred into a language he no longer understood. Across the room, Harold King waited silently. Hands folded, his expression unreadable. Finally, Marcus re-entered, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the sweat from the sunlit address still drying on his brow. He did not sit. He stood before Ethan, neither gloating nor condescending, but with the presence of a man who believed even the fallen deserved dignity if they were willing to learn. "You have 3 minutes left," Marcus said quietly. Ethan looked up, his eyes red, not from tears, but from disbelief, humiliation, and the collapse of a worldview he'd never thought to question. "Why me?" he asked, not in anger, but in something close to a whisper. "Why did you let me do that? Why didn't you stop me sooner?" Marcus inhaled, then answered without hesitation. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go, how much damage you'd do when you thought no one was watching. Because that's when character reveals itself, not in meetings, not in metrics, but in moments when power isn't being measured." He stepped closer, You didn't fail because of a bad calculation. You failed because you believed status was greater than substance. Ethan looked away, unable to meet his gaze, and now what he asked almost bitterly. I'm supposed to, what, go teach kids how to mix concrete and read stress diagrams? You think they'll respect me? Marcus studied him for a long, silent beat. They don't need to respect your title, they'll respect your honesty. If you earn it, just like I had to. He placed a hand on the folder. This is your choice, not your punishment. What happens next will define who you are, not to me, but to yourself. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving Ethan alone with the decision that would determine whether his future would be built on bitterness or rebuilding. Outside in a separate corner of the site, Marcus convened with Harold and several senior staff. Effective immediately, he said, "We're launching Phase 2 of our internal talent recognition initiative." Harold nodded. "You're referring to the peer review mentorship track?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "I want every crew member given an opportunity to be mentored across departments. Every worker, every intern, no more invisible walls." The team immediately began drafting protocols, organizing task groups, and assigning internal liaisons. While they moved forward, Marcus took a moment to step away and walk down the gravel path toward the southeast wing, the one that had troubled him most. He paused near the foundation edge where the microcracks had first been dismissed and crouched down to examine the exposed segment. A shadow passed beside him, Walter Green, his old friend and former foreman, now quietly approaching, with the ease of someone who had seen Marcus through every phase of his rise. "Still hands-on," I see, Walter said with a half-smile. Marcus chuckled lightly. "Old habits die hard." Then his tone shifted. "I knew when I walked back onto this site, under cover, that things had changed, but I didn't expect it to cut this deep. This wasn't just one man's arrogance, this was cultural erosion." Walter nodded, looking over the foundation edge. "But culture," he said, "can be rebuilt, if the blueprints are honest." Marcus smiled at that. "That's why I started Titan Core, Walter. Not just to build skyscrapers, but to build something better between the steel." They stood in silence for a moment, then turned as the trailer door opened again. Ethan emerged, walking slowly, carrying the signed voluntary agreement in one hand. His steps were not confident, but they were deliberate. He walked straight to Marcus and held out the papers. "I'll do it," he said, simply. Marcus took the documents, scanned them, and then extended his hand. Ethan hesitated, then shook it awkwardly. Uncertainly, but not insincerely. "Orientation begins Monday," Marcus said. "You'll be teaching basics to a group of teens from East Point. Many of them are on probation. Some have never had a mentor. Don't show up with a lecture. Show up with humility." Ethan nodded once. Understood. As he walked off toward the lot where his sleek black car had once sat, now replaced by a used Toyota Camry he'd borrowed from a friend, his posture still bore the weight of consequence. But for the first time, he didn't drag his feet in shame. He walked as if he had work to do, and perhaps redemption to earn. Meanwhile, Marcus turned back toward the foundation with Walter and said, "Let's re-pour this quadrant, but this time, let's make sure everyone gets a say before the cement sets." And so, under the orange haze of a descending Georgia sun, the site buzzed once more, machines resuming their growl radios, crackling with instructions, and a sense of something intangible being laid down beneath the steel. Not just a stronger foundation for the building above, but the first real steps toward a new foundation of human respect, built not on status or race or credentials, but on the shared labor of those who still believed in listening before judging, lifting before blaming, and building something far greater than just walls. Monday morning arrived with a gray sky hanging low over Atlanta, the kind that made the city feel slower, more reflective, as though it too were absorbing the aftershocks of what had transpired at the Titan Core site just days earlier. At a modest community center in East Point, its walls covered in murals of rising fists, stacked bricks, and hopeful eyes. Ethan Cole stood nervously at the front of a half-renovated classroom, its linoleum floors scuffed, its metal chairs misaligned, and its windows half-fogged from the damp air. He adjusted the collar of his shirt no longer, Armani, but a simple off-the-rack button-up, and glanced at the chalkboard behind him where someone had written in large blocky letters, "Foundations building more than buildings." Behind those words were faces real and skeptical. 15 teenagers, mostly black and brown, a few in oversized hoodies, others in work shirts, too big for their frames, eyes that had seen too much disappointment and were trained to spot insincerity in seconds. Ethan cleared his throat and forced a smile that wavered. "Good morning," he began, but the greeting landed with a thud. No one responded. Some slouched deeper in their chairs. One boy muttered something under his breath and smirked at the girl next to him. Ethan looked down at his notes, over-prepared slides on structural integrity load, calculation, and stress resistance. But he already knew none of that mattered here, not yet. This wasn't a boardroom. This was a battleground of trust. He looked up and did something he hadn't done in years, maybe ever. He closed his laptop. "You know what?" he said, stepping in front of the desk. "Forget the slides. I want to talk to you. Not at you, with you." A girl near the back rolled her eyes. "Ain't that what they all say?" Ethan smiled faintly, acknowledging the jab. "Probably, and most of them probably didn't deserve your time. That caught a few off guard. But I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm here because I messed up bad." The room went still. He had their attention now, not because he had demanded it, but because he had surrendered something first. Last week he continued, "I was working on the biggest project of my career, a 30-story tower in downtown Atlanta. Big money, big titles. I was the lead engineer, thought I was untouchable, thought I knew everything." He paused, the memory still raw. "Then I told a man, an older black construction worker, to shut up in front of everyone. Laughed at him. I mocked him, dismissed what he had to say. A tall kid in the front leaned forward curious, and Ethan exhaled. Turned out he was the owner of the whole damn company, built it from the ground up. While I was bragging about my Stanford degree, he was out there pouring concrete that wouldn't crack under a hurricane." A few of the students exchanged glances. The mood shifted. The wall they'd built between them and this stranger. This failed CEO in khakis began to tilt. Ethan continued. "He gave me two choices, face legal charges for negligence or come here and teach. Not as punishment, as a chance to do something real." For the first time a hand went up. It was the same girl who'd rolled her eyes. "So why'd you really come?" she asked. "You afraid of jail?" Ethan looked her in the eye. "No," he said. "I'm afraid of becoming the kind of man who never learns from his mistakes." Silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of possibility of reconsideration. "All right then," another student muttered. "Teach us something, smart guy." Ethan laughed, not mockingly, but with relief. He picked up a piece of chalk and walked to the board. "Let's start with weight distribution," he said, drawing a quick sketch of a foundation cross-section. "Because if you don't understand what happens below the surface, everything you build will collapse. And that's not just about buildings. That's about life." The rest of the morning was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. The students challenged him not disrespectfully, but with raw curiosity. They asked questions no engineering professor ever had. They brought street logic into technical diagrams, connected rebar tension to emotional resilience and related load balancing to their own survival in unstable homes. And Ethan for once didn't correct them. He learned from them. By noon they had moved outside, huddled around a donated toolkit and a half-built concrete platform. Ethan watched as one kid, Rashad, a wiry 17-year-old with sharp eyes and quick hands, improvised a way to balance a makeshift beam using stacked bricks and cinder blocks. "Have you ever thought about going into architecture?" Ethan asked. Rashad shrugged. "Ain't nobody got money for college, man." Ethan nodded quietly, filing that answer deep into his memory. That night, after dismissing the group with an uncharacteristic high-five exchange and watching them scatter into the city streets, Ethan didn't go home. Instead, he drove back to the Titan Core site and parked at the far end near the very foundation quadrant that had nearly cracked everything apart. The sky was darker now, scattered stars peeking through the light pollution, and the skeleton of the tower loomed above him like a shadow of his former self. He got out, walked to the spot, crouched down and ran his fingers across the repaired section. No flaws. Solid. Now. Recast. Realigned. Just like him. Maybe. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was Marcus. "How was your first day?" He asked without preamble. Ethan stood and turned, surprised, but not alarmed. Humbling, he said. "In all the right ways." Marcus nodded, then handed him a file. "That kid Rashad, he's sharp. We're setting up a Titan Core-sponsored scholarship. I want you to mentor him through it. From application to graduation." Ethan took the file. "Surprised?" "You trust me with that?" Marcus smiled, tired but sincere. Not yet, he said, but I trust what you're becoming. And with that he turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there, file in hand, beneath a building he had once tried to rush to completion, and now saw as a reflection of something he had only just begun to build within himself. The days that followed unfolded like the measured rhythm of brick after brick being laid with purpose, not haste. And for the first time in Ethan Cole's adult life, he began to understand the difference between leading and posturing, between being respected and being obeyed out of fear. Each morning he arrived at the East Point Training Center, before the student sweeping the floor himself, organizing the donated tools, testing the small cement mixer that often sputtered on colder mornings, and checking the material list to make sure every student had what they needed. The students started to notice they no longer met him with suspicion, but with curious side glances and nods of quiet acknowledgement. In one session he introduced a lesson on torque and sheer strength, by pulling apart a broken skateboard one of the students had brought in, using its snap truck to illustrate stress fracture points. This, Ethan said, holding the splintered piece of maple deck up to the light, is what happens when the force exceeds the material's flexibility, kind of like what happens when life hits you harder than you're ready for. But that doesn't mean you're useless. It just means you've got to reinforce the next time. There was a stillness in the room after that. Not the bored stillness of disengaged teens, but the deep contemplative stillness of young people realizing someone was finally speaking their language. That afternoon, Rashad lingered behind after class. "You really think I can be an architect?" he asked, voice low. Unsure, Ethan looked up from where he was coiling extension cords. "I don't think it," he said. "I know it. You've got an instinct for space balance and structure. That's rare. Most people just memorize formulas. You see things?" Rashad didn't reply right away. He looked down his sneakers, scuffing the floor. "My cousin said, nobody in this city's gonna hire a black kid from East Point to design skyscrapers." Ethan's jaw tightened. He took a breath. "Then we build our own." That night, Ethan drove back to his small rental apartment in Midtown and sat at his kitchen table with a pen, a legal pad, and the Titan Core employee portal open on his laptop. He drafted a full proposal for a new internal pipeline program, one that would take students from Titan Core's community programs and place them into real apprenticeships, mentorships, even college application, sponsorships. He didn't stop writing until the sun began to bleed across the skyline. The next morning, he stood outside Marcus Bradley's office, unsure if he would be welcomed or dismissed. He knocked. "Come in," came the deep voice from within. Marcus sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp, but not unfriendly. "Didn't expect you this early." Ethan handed him the file. "I want to help build something better than buildings," he said. Marcus opened it, flipping through the pages. His brow raised slightly at the level of detail, phased implementation, cost analysis, potential partner organizations. "You stayed up all night writing this." "Yes. And you think this makes up for what happened?" Marcus asked, not cruelly but directly. Ethan didn't flinch. "No," he replied. "But maybe it makes use of it." Marcus leaned back, studying him. "You're starting to sound like a man who understands what foundations really are." For a moment, neither said anything. Then Marcus nodded. "Let's pilot it at the Southside site." "And Ethan?" "Yes. You mentor Rashad. Personally, I'll cover the tuition if he gets accepted, but he's your responsibility. Until then." Ethan nodded, emotion catching unexpectedly in his throat. Understood. The following week, Ethan returned to the East Point Center with renewed purpose. But something had changed, not just in how he moved, but in how the students saw him. He was no longer just a former boss in exile. He was now someone who had come back with blueprints not just for buildings, but for opportunity. They began arriving early. They stayed late. Rashad started drafting rough sketches of bridges on the backs of scrap wood. A quiet girl named Liana built a perfect miniature foundation model out of cardboard and PVC in one night after class. Ethan saw it all, and each time he documented it, uploaded it, filed their names into a new system Titan Core had just launched, the Horizon program, named symbolically after what Marcus once said. "A skyline means nothing if no one below it sees a path to rise." One Friday, Marcus visited the classroom. He didn't announce himself, didn't speak. He simply stood in the back, watching. The students didn't recognize him. At first, he wore jeans and a hoodie blended in. But when Rashad caught him watching and whispered to Liana, Her eyes went wide. "Yo," she whispered. "That's him. That's the one." Marcus stepped forward, smiled faintly. "So, this is the crew," he said. "I heard you're learning how to rebuild what others thought was broken." Rashad grinned. "We're not just learning," he said. "We're practicing." Marcus nodded. "That's how you build legacy?" After class, Marcus and Ethan walked out to the parking lot. "They're incredible," Ethan said, almost in awe. Marcus nodded. "Yes, and for years they were invisible to people like you, and like me when I forgot where I came from." He turned toward the horizon where cranes dotted the skyline. "We're not just changing one site, we're changing the industry. And it starts with this generation seeing that they belong not just on the ground floor, but at the table where designs begin." Ethan looked back toward the center where Rashad stood at the door waving goodbye. "He's going to make it, isn't he?" Marcus nodded. "If we don't fail him." And with that they parted, not as former enemies, not quite as friends, but as co-architects of something far more durable than concrete, an infrastructure of belief reborn from the ruins of pride, prejudice, and second chances. The sun rose early on a brisk Monday, casting a golden wash across the rising framework of Titan Core's Southside development site, where steel beams pierced the Atlanta sky like the ribs of some great unfinished giant. But this morning, the site felt different. Not because of the structures, but because of the people moving through it, with more purpose, more mutual acknowledgement, and less invisible division. Ethan Cole stood on the eastern perimeter near a temporary workstation clipboard in hand hard hat, back on his head, not as a symbol of authority, but as armor reclaimed through humility. His eyes followed Rashad, now clad in a neon vest, 2 sizes too big, confidently pacing out a concrete pour line beside 2 seasoned foremen who were no longer dismissing him with nods or grunts, but actually listening when he offered input. "Yo, mister." Cole Rashad shouted across the hum of machines. "We're short 2 crossbars for Section D. Gonna need to double-check the delivery manifest, or it'll throw off the backfill schedule." Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned, not just by the technical accuracy, but by the tone, decisive, professional. He smiled, lifting the radio to his mouth. "Copy that, I'll check the supply trailer. Good catch." Just 6 weeks ago, Rashad hadn't known the difference between a joist and a girder. Now he was tracking site integrity with the instincts of someone born to design cities. Later that morning, the newly launched Titan Core Horizon program held its first official on-site shadowing rotation, pairing youth trainees like Liana and Rashad with various department heads across engineering, project management, and safety inspection. Ethan walked through the pairings, personally making sure each mentor understood that this was not a charity exercise. It was talent development. "Don't babysit them," he said to one site coordinator. "Train them like they'll be running this place in 10 years, because they might." Word had already spread about what had happened at the last site. Rumors whispered through the construction community like wildfire, how the arrogant engineer got humbled by a bricklayer who turned out to be the billionaire CEO, but no one dared mock Ethan now. His transformation had become its own myth, a man who not only accepted his fall, but chose to climb again slower, this time, steadier, carrying others with him. Around noon, Marcus arrived on site unannounced. He made a habit of that, now not because he enjoyed surprises, but because he wanted authenticity. He parked far from the main trailers and walked the perimeter, first, noting the distribution of safety signs, the accuracy of scaffold setup, the demeanor of supervisors. When he finally approached the core site, a crowd of workers mostly young, many from Horizon's outreach network, gathered around a table where Ethan was running a live demonstration on post-tension cable placement. Marcus stood quietly at the edge, arms folded. "All right," Ethan said, looking up from the diagram. "Some of you are going to think this is over your head. But let me tell you something. I thought that once too. And then someone taught me that what matters isn't how fast you learn, it's how deeply you understand." He turned to Liana, handing her the tool. "You do it. Show them." She hesitated for a split second, then stepped forward, adjusted the tension, and executed the sequence perfectly. The workers around her erupted in applause. Ethan clapped with them, but his eyes found Marcus in the back, and in that moment, a glance passed between them, not for approval, but recognition. Later, Marcus pulled Ethan aside. "You're building something stronger than any of our towers," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. "We're laying the real foundation now." Marcus glanced at the bustling yard, the laughter, the sweat, the pride. "But now comes the real test," he said. "What happens when this momentum hits resistance?" That resistance arrived sooner than expected. The next morning, Ethan received an urgent message from the central office. The city's zoning board was suddenly delaying final inspection approvals for Titan Corps' North Corridor housing project, a site critical to the expansion of the Horizon mentorship pipeline. The reason: an anonymous complaint questioning the qualifications of Horizon trainees operating on live construction zones. Ethan's jaw clenched. He knew this tactic, sabotage through policy. Someone out there didn't like the idea of black and brown teens from East Point operating heavy equipment and running soil tests on million-dollar properties. Marcus called an emergency strategy meeting. In the glass-walled conference room, he sat at the head of the table, flanked by Ethan Harold and two legal advisors. "They're trying to drown us in red tape," the lead attorney said. "If we don't respond fast, they'll revoke our next permit cycle." Ethan looked at Marcus. "We can prove our training is certified, OSHA compliant. Fully documented facts don't matter to people who are threatened by change," Marcus replied evenly. "But transparency does." That afternoon, Titan Corps released a full video briefing to the public, featuring footage of the Horizon trainees on site, showing their skills, their progress, their mentors. In one clip, Rashad walked through a segment of blueprint logistics with clarity that would impress a senior project manager. In another, Liana explained safety inspection tags with calm authority. The video went viral in the Atlanta business community. Support poured in: contractors offering internships, city officials offering to visit sites personally. But not everyone was applauding. Anonymous hate messages began appearing on Horizon social pages. Some accused the company of pushing diversity theater. Others warned of lowered standards. Ethan read them, sickened, then responded with something simple. When you fear people you once ignored, it means they've already begun to rise. He didn't post it under a pseudonym. He signed it with his full name. That night, Marcus called him. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. "I wasn't ready before. I am now." And as the sun dipped below the edge of the skyline, casting long shadows across the very tower whose flawed foundation had once symbolized everything broken, it now stood firm, recast, bearing weight, not only of steel and glass, but of second chances, earned trust, and the will to fight for a future that was no longer just built for a few, but finally being shaped by the many. The backlash didn't fade. It evolved like a disease desperate to outlive the cure, growing smarter, sneakier, shifting from public smears to behind-the-scenes sabotage that struck not at Titan Corps' image, but at its very infrastructure. A week after the viral video campaign celebrating the Horizon trainees, a materials shipment for the Southside site mysteriously failed its compliance inspection. Not because the product was faulty, but because the paperwork had been misfiled, delaying the project's most visible milestone by 3 days and costing the company tens of thousands. Then came a surprise audit from the State Construction Licensing Board, claiming that several of Titan Corps' trainers lacked current accreditation. A claim later proven false, but not before it temporarily froze 2 job sites, halting progress and putting nearly 100 workers on idle. Ethan Cole felt the pressure build in his chest, like a steel beam under excessive load. Every day he fought on 2 fronts, leading a revolution on site, where young underestimated minds were finally being seen and pushing back against an entrenched system built to keep them out. Still, he refused to falter. He rose earlier, stayed later, met each blow with quiet resolve, and every evening returned to the East Point Center, where Rashad, Liana, and the other trainees continued to show up with raw hunger and growing confidence. "They're watching us," Rashad told Ethan one evening as they walked through a nearly finished training module. "They want us to fail, to prove that this whole thing is just a stunt." Ethan paused, hand resting on the wooden frame of a mock wall build. "Then we show them we don't break, we build better." But even Ethan couldn't deny the exhaustion setting in. One night, after a 12-hour day split between site management, media interviews, and teaching, he returned to his apartment and collapsed on the couch without even removing his boots. When he awoke hours later, the moon had shifted, and on the coffee table sat the proposal he had once drafted for the Horizon program, now marked up with red ink and handwritten notes. Notes he hadn't made. He blinked, sat up, heart racing. A voice came from the kitchen. "I let myself in." You sleep like a man who used to think he knew everything. It was Marcus Calm, collected leaning against the counter with a mug in hand, dressed down in jeans and a dark Henley, eyes tired but alert. "You're burning out," he said plainly. Ethan rubbed his face. "We're under attack. They're trying to destroy this from every angle." Marcus nodded. "Of course they are. You think shaking the foundation of an entire industry wouldn't cause aftershocks?" He walked over, dropped into the armchair opposite. "Let me tell you something most CEOs will never admit. The hardest part of leadership isn't vision. It's endurance," Ethan exhaled. "I feel like I'm being tested, you are," Marcus said, "but not by them. By you. You're testing yourself to see how much truth you're willing to carry when it gets heavy." He picked up the proposal again, tapped a page. "This idea, it's already working, but now it needs to evolve." Ethan leaned forward, how Marcus looked him dead in the eye by no longer being yours alone. "You started this. Now, share it. Bring others in. Let this be bigger than you. If you don't, it'll collapse under the weight of your own limits." The next morning, Ethan did exactly that. At a company-wide meeting streamed across all active Titan Core sites, he stood beside Marcus and introduced the formation of the Horizon Alliance, a new leadership collective composed of mentors, veteran workers, community leaders, and former trainees, all tasked with guiding the expansion of the Horizon program across the region. Every person in the alliance would have equal say, equal vote, and equal responsibility. That same week, he promoted Rashad as the first junior co-instructor at the East Point Center, and Liana was given a paid summer internship shadowing Titan Core's lead design architect. The ripple effect was immediate applications from young people. Tripled former skeptics within the company began volunteering. Even one of the city council members, who had once voiced concerns about unqualified youth, now publicly endorsed the initiative. But resistance like mold crept where the light hadn't yet reached. An anonymous letter arrived at Titan Core headquarters, accusing Ethan of engineering without a conscience, and claimed the Horizon trainees were being used as props for PR. It included grainy photos heavily edited of Rashad, standing on scaffolding during a lesson. A moment taken out of context to suggest negligence. The letter made its way to several media outlets. One ran a headline, "Our construction sites becoming classrooms, at the cost of safety." Ethan stared at the headline, fury boiling beneath his skin, not for himself but for Rashad, for every kid who would read that and feel like their dream was a liability. "We need to fight back," Harold said during the emergency meeting. "We sue, no." Marcus interrupted. "We reveal." That weekend, Marcus organized a live public showcase at the Southside site, inviting city officials, journalists, educators, and families. Over 100 people attended. In the center of the event, a temporary training station was constructed, and standing there under the banner that read, "Future Built," here was Rashad with a mic clipped to his collar, walking the crowd through a real-time foundation. "Stress simulation. What you see here," he said, confidently pointing at the projection, "isn't just a lesson, it's a life. And when someone like me gets to learn this, not behind a textbook but beside a mentor, that's not a risk, that's a revolution." The audience erupted, reporters took notes, cameras rolled, and the next day a new headline appeared. "From bricklayer to builder of hope. The program changing Atlanta's skyline." Ethan sat in his car reading it, eyes glistening, not because they'd won but because they'd endured. And as he looked up at the tower, rising in the distance, once shadowed by scandal, now glowing with new light, he understood that this was no longer just a story of redemption. It was a blueprint for resistance, etched not in concrete but in conviction, built by the very hands once dismissed, now rising, now unshakable. The days that followed the public showcase felt like sunlight, breaking through storm clouds, brief, warm, and dangerous to mistake for permanence. While the media momentarily shifted in favor of the Horizon program, while Ethan Cole's inbox filled with invitations to speak at industry panels and community forums, and while the Titan Core sites reported higher worker morale than ever recorded, Marcus Bradley remained acutely aware of one truth: the closer you get to changing a system, the more violently it fights back. And that resistance came not in the form of angry tweets or anonymous letters this time, but in something far more methodical: a citywide labor union board member named Dean Wallace, a man who had long held sway over regional construction standards and whose influence could derail, or disqualify a project with nothing more than a signed memo. Dean wasn't openly antagonistic. No, that would have been too easy to fight. He was polite, formal, and precise, and it was in that precision that the trap was laid. One Tuesday morning during a routine quarterly compliance meeting, he sat across from Marcus and Ethan in the city development office, a polite smile resting behind thin wire-rimmed glasses, his voice as smooth as poured asphalt. "We've reviewed your Horizon documentation," he said, flipping casually through a thick dossier. "Impressive, really, progressive, but we're concerned about liability." Ethan tensed. "We follow every safety protocol. Our trainees are monitored, our sites pass third-party inspections." Weakly, Dean nodded slowly. "Yes, yes. And yet, there are whispers that a few incidents were minimized, that certain small errors weren't logged. Nothing major, but enough to raise flags, and enough for me to recommend a full stop until we've completed an audit." Marcus leaned forward, voice steady. "Let me be clear. If this is about punishing innovation, we'll fight it at every level." Dean didn't blink. "It's not punishment, it's policy. You've introduced an educational component to an industrial environment. That's uncharted ground. And uncharted ground often comes with unexpected sinkholes." Ethan could barely contain himself. "So we're being penalized for creating opportunity." Dean offered a dry smile. "You're being reviewed. If there's nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." And with that, he closed the folder, stood and exited. The audit began the next morning. Over 24 officials arrived at 3 Titan Core sites, combing through records, interviewing workers, inspecting everything from chemical storage to first aid kits. The pressure was suffocating. Rashad, now leading the youth construction module at the East Point Center, wasn't spared either. His every lesson was scrutinized, every interaction recorded. For the first time, Ethan saw doubt creep into the boy's eyes. "Maybe they're right," Rashad said, after class one day. "Maybe I don't belong here." Ethan crouched beside him near the supply shed, voice low but fierce. "They're not coming after you because you don't belong. They're coming because you do, and that terrifies them." That night, Marcus summoned Ethan to the rooftop of the original Titan Core tower, the very building that had started it all. As they stood looking out across the Atlanta skyline, Marcus broke the silence. "You know what they did to my grandfather?" Ethan turned. "He worked construction too." "Yeah," Marcus said, "except he wasn't allowed to supervise white workers. Even when he knew more, he'd whisper instructions to a younger white foreman who'd repeat them loud enough to be followed. My grandfather died without ever being called boss, but everyone on that crew knew he ran it." Ethan looked away, fists clenched. "How did you deal with that growing up?" Marcus smiled sadly. "I built something he couldn't be denied, but legacy," he added, turning to Ethan, "only matters if we protect it, and now it's your turn." The audit dragged on. Rumors circulated, funding delays, permit freezes, potential blacklisting. But the Horizon trainees didn't stop. They showed up, they studied harder. They executed drills like their futures depended on it because they did. Liana began helping other students file college applications. Rashad built a 3D printed model of a suspension bridge that earned a visit from a local university engineering rep. Then, on a Thursday morning, the audit team returned with results. The entire staff gathered in the Southside site's main trailer. Dean Wallace entered, briefcase in hand. Face unreadable. "We've completed our investigation," he said, "and despite extensive review, we found no violations." Relief flooded the room, but he wasn't done. However, he added, "We're issuing a recommendation." The silence was immediate at the Horizon program. Dean continued to be recognized officially by the Georgia State Apprenticeship Council and used as a model for other companies seeking to merge vocational training with live-site experience. Gasps broke out. Ethan stared in disbelief. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I assume that comes with a formal report." Dean nodded, finally allowing a small, almost respectful smile, delivered by end of week. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Ethan. "You still have enemies, but today you earned the attention of allies, too." When he was gone, the room erupted. Rashad hugged Liana. Foremen who once dismissed the program high-fived their apprentices. Ethan stood still for a moment, overwhelmed, then felt a hand on his shoulder. "Marcus?" "This wasn't just survival," Marcus said. "This was victory." "But Ethan," his voice hoarse, replied, "then let's make it count." That night, for the first time, Rashad stepped onto a stage at the Atlanta Community Builders Forum, introduced as a Horizon Fellow. He spoke not just of foundations and tensile strength, but of courage, second chances, and the importance of being seen. "We're not your PR story," he said into the mic. "We're your future, and we're already here." The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes, and somewhere in the crowd, Ethan wept, not from shame or exhaustion, but from the quiet, solid truth that something he helped build might finally outlive him, unshaken. The forum applause still echoed in Ethan Cole's ears as he stepped out into the crisp night air, his chest rising not with pride, but with something deeper reverence perhaps, for the resilience he had witnessed on that stage, for the transformation of a boy who had once doubted his place in the world, into a voice that now commanded rooms full of architects, developers, and policymakers. Rashad had not just delivered a speech, he had issued a challenge to an industry long comfortable in its rigidity, long content to exclude under the guise of standards. As Ethan walked toward the parking lot, his phone buzzed an incoming call from Marcus. "How's it feel?" Marcus asked, voice low but warm. "Feels like the foundation just moved," Ethan replied. Marcus chuckled softly. "Good. Tomorrow we break new ground. I want you at City Hall by 10. Bring the Horizon team and wear a suit." Ethan blinked. "What's happening?" "The mayor's about to make a statement," Marcus said. "We're going public, full partnership. City-backed Horizon expansion, 5 boroughs, 30 sites. You've earned?" Ethan's pulse quickened. It was happening faster than he could process. But as he hung up and looked toward the city skyline, a flicker of caution rose in his chest. He remembered Marcus's warning. The closer you come to real change, the more unpredictable the resistance. And resistance was indeed waiting. At precisely 9:55 a.m. The next morning, Ethan and Rashad arrived at City Hall, trailed by Liana and 3 other Horizon trainees, all dressed sharply in navy polos, bearing the Titan Core Horizon insignia. The press was already setting up outside the steps, cameras adjusting lenses, sound crews pinning wireless mics to lapels. Inside the council chamber, Marcus stood beside Mayor Andrea Whitmore, a progressive force in Atlanta politics known for her no-nonsense stance on labor reform and education. Behind them was a banner that read, "Building Tomorrow Today." The mayor began her speech with poise outlining the data-backed success of the Horizon model. The drop in youth unemployment, the measurable increase in safety compliance, and the boost to citywide construction productivity. She introduced Rashad, who again stunned the room with his clarity and conviction. And then she turned to Ethan. "This is a man who once lost his way," she said, "but instead of hiding from his failure, he rebuilt, and in doing so, helped us rediscover what this city could become." Ethan stepped to the podium, heart pounding, and delivered a speech he hadn't written down. "Buildings don't collapse because people fail," he said. "They collapse because no one listens when people speak." Horizon was never about charity. It was about listening, about seeing what's been ignored for too long. These trainees, these future engineers, they're not lucky to be here, we're lucky to have them, applause thundered. But outside the chamber, storm clouds were forming. As the group exited to greet the press, a protest had begun to gather at the base of the steps. Dozens of people held signs, some reading, "Save Union," "Jobs," others more pointed, "No kids on job sites." And worse, engineering requires earning it, not handouts. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he motioned for Ethan to stay calm. Reporters swarmed in. "Mr. Cole, how do you respond to critics who say you're lowering standards?" "Mr. Bradley is Horizon, replacing certified labor with untrained teens." Ethan stepped forward. "We're not replacing anyone. We're expanding the field. We're making room at the table. Standards aren't being lowered, they're being enforced with humanity." But even as he spoke, a figure emerged from the crowd. Dean Wallace. He wasn't holding a sign, nor was he chanting. He simply stood with arms crossed, expression unreadable. Surprised to see me, he asked when Marcus approached. Marcus studied him. "No. You're not done yet, are you?" Dean shrugged. "You've won this round, but public goodwill is fickle, and the moment something goes wrong, one slip, one minor injury, one headline, you'll lose it all." Marcus nodded slowly. Then we'll just have to keep building things right. Dean leaned in. I wonder, Marcus, will your trainees be this perfect forever? And then he turned and vanished into the crowd like a ghost of bureaucracy past. That night back at the Horizon Training Center, Ethan gathered the senior mentors. We need to double every safety drill, triple check every protocol, every site, every shift. They nodded, no questions asked. Rashad stayed behind after the meeting. You think they're gonna come harder? Now Ethan nodded. They have to, because we've proven what they said was impossible. Rashad smiled faintly. Then let's keep doing the impossible. Over the next month, Horizon rolled out new satellite programs across 3 more districts, each operated by a rotating team of senior workers and trainees. Rashad was given his own site to manage under full supervision. Liana's architectural internship was extended, and she was preparing her portfolio for early college admission. The Horizon Alliance was now not just a collective, it was a movement. Then, one day it happened. A trainee, 16-year-old Jeremiah, slipped on a wet slab during a light rain drill. He broke his wrist. It was minor, non-life-threatening. He was treated, released, and back on site within 2 weeks. But the news didn't care about truth, it cared about story. And within hours, headlines screamed, Horizon trainee, injured on active site, city safety. In question, reporters flooded Titan Corps' inboxes. City officials started requesting emergency reviews. Dean Wallace released a vague statement about oversight concerns. Ethan watched it all unfold, pulse racing. It's a setup, he told Marcus. They're using the first fall as proof. We're reckless. Marcus nodded grimly. Then we don't just respond, we reveal. The following day, Titan Corps held a public hearing. But this time, they didn't bring lawyers. They brought data. Herald projected safety statistics. Horizon sites reported 62% fewer injuries than industry averages. Compliance rates exceeded national standards. Then Jeremiah himself took the mic. I slipped, he said. It was an accident. It could have happened to anyone. But because I'm part of Horizon, I got training support, and I'm coming back smarter, stronger. And you know what? I'm still proud to be here. That broke the spell. The press shifted tone. The story became resilience, not risk. Dean Wallace stayed quiet, for now. And Ethan knew it wouldn't be the last time they'd be tested. But when he stepped outside after the hearing and saw Rashad waiting for him, smiling, holding 2 cups of coffee and a set of blueprints for a new mentorship hub they were building together, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, not just hope, but momentum. And it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to all of them, to every hand once overlooked, to every name once ignored. And as the city lights glowed against the evening sky, the Horizon logo cast onto the walls of City Hall from a projector across the street, Ethan whispered to himself a promise he would never forget. We don't just build towers anymore, we build people, and no force in this city is strong enough to tear that down. The morning after the public hearing, the Horizon Training Center buzzed with a new kind of energy, not just from the victory they'd secured in the face of scandal, but from the weight of what it meant to win the right way, without bending, without hiding, without sacrificing a single truth. Ethan Cole stood just outside the main workshop, as rays of early sunlight pierced through the metal beams and scaffold shadows, watching Rashad teach a group of younger recruits how to measure slab gradients with laser precision. His voice calm and confident, carried with an authority born not from ego, but earned trust. Ethan smiled faintly, stepping back and letting the moment breathe without interference. These trainees, some of whom had never held a ruler straight 3 months ago, were now speaking in terms of shear load tension zones and ground vibration patterns as fluently as most graduates of engineering programs. And they weren't just mimicking, they were understanding, building, leading. As the morning drills wrapped, Liana approached Ethan holding 2 folders. These are college essays from the weekend group. They want feedback by Friday. She paused, then added with a smirk. Also, one of them says, you're the reason they want to be an engineer now. Said they saw a video of you teaching trust theory with a stack of pancakes. Ethan laughed. That was a desperate Saturday and a broken projector. Liana shrugged, still worked. She walked off to prep her next lesson, and Ethan lingered there for a moment, watching her disappear behind the doors of a future she was actively shaping. Just then, a notification buzzed on his phone. A calendar invite. Marcus had requested an unscheduled boardroom session with the executive team, the subject line reading only, the next phase. Ethan's curiosity spiked. Titan Core had already expanded, Horizon beyond its original scope. What next phase could possibly raise the stakes further? He arrived at headquarters an hour later to find not just Marcus and Harold in the room, but also three unfamiliar faces. Two women and a man, all dressed sharply, their expressions observant but open. Ethan, Marcus said, gesturing to an empty seat beside him, "Meet the strategic delegation from Builders United." Ethan blinked. Builders United was one of the largest infrastructure coalitions in the eastern United States, a network known for billion-dollar contracts, international builds, and historically not the most progressive history when it came to grassroots collaboration. "They've seen what we've done," Marcus continued. "They want to explore partnership." Ethan sat slowly. "With Horizon." The older woman across from him, her graying hair pulled into a tight twist, nodded. "We've been monitoring your progress for months. Your retention rate, your safety performance, your equity model. You've proven a new blueprint is possible." Ethan looked from her to Marcus, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "So, what does this mean?" he asked. The younger man spoke next. "We want to pilot Horizon as a model across 6 other states. If it works, we'll propose a national adaptation." Ethan's mind spun. "National? That wasn't just a program, that was a movement, but we need you." The second woman added, "Not just as a project manager, as a co-director of the entire expansion." Ethan felt the weight of that offer settle in his chest. "What about my trainees?" "My center's Atlanta," Marcus answered gently. "They'll be led by those you trained. You didn't build this to keep it small, Ethan. You built it so it could grow beyond you." Ethan sat in silence. So much of his life had once been built around control, around titles, metrics, outcomes he could predict. But Horizon had taught him something else. Real growth meant letting go. "I'll do it," he said finally. "On one condition. We keep the local leadership intact. Every city gets to shape Horizon in their own image. We don't franchise dignity." The woman smiled. "That's why we came to you." Over the next weeks the transition began. Ethan spent his days split between onboarding new regional coordinators in cities like Birmingham, Richmond, and Charlotte, and late nights back at East Point, slowly passing more and more leadership to Rashad, Liana, and the others. They didn't hesitate when Ethan told Rashad he'd be stepping away. The young man simply nodded and said, "You gave us the blueprints. Now let us build." On his final day at the original Horizon Center, Ethan held a quiet farewell circle. No speeches, no banners, just one question he posed to the group. "What will you build next?" The answers ranged from bridges to hospitals, to community parks, to mentorship networks. Then Liana spoke up. "We're going to build what we never had, so no one feels like they're too late to start." Ethan smiled, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Then you've already surpassed me." That evening, as he packed the last few binders and blueprints into his car, he stood in the lot for a long time, staring at the skyline he once thought only men in glass towers could shape. Behind him, the training center glowed warmly in the dark alive, with laughter drills and futures being forged by hands once underestimated. Marcus joined him quietly. "You ready?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Not even close. But I'm going anyway." And with that, he turned. The key started the engine and drove toward a road paved not with certainty, but with purpose. Headlights carving through the dark, like belief itself. Quiet, steady, and built to last. The months that followed Ethan Cole's departure from the East Point Horizon Center were not a quiet descent into corporate comfort, but a whirlwind ascent into national momentum. A rare phenomenon where a once local initiative born from personal failure and public redemption evolved into a full-scale movement that began reshaping the very landscape of workforce development across the United States. From Charlotte to Cleveland, from Baton Rouge to Baltimore, Horizon Centers began to open one by one, each with their own mentors, their own student leaders, but all grounded in the same founding principles: dignity before hierarchy, learning through doing, and voices rising from below, not imposed from above. Ethan found himself in a different city almost every week sometimes, giving keynote speeches in front of hundreds of business leaders, other times sitting on plastic chairs in the dimly lit community gymnasiums, listening to a 17-year-old explain how he fixed a foundation crack in his mother's home, using techniques he'd learned 2 weeks earlier. But with each handshake, each blueprint rollout, each safety workshop in a borrowed school hallway, Ethan felt something shift, not just in the country, but in himself. He no longer saw his reflection as the man who had once humiliated a bricklayer in public. That version of him was gone, dismantled, humbled, and rebuilt, brick by the people he once thought he was. Above, one evening after returning from a pilot center launch in Detroit, Ethan stepped into his modest apartment in D.C., his new home base, and found a small envelope slid under his door. Inside was a handwritten invitation from Marcus Bradley. It was brief. "Come home. We're dedicating the new tower." The next morning, Ethan boarded a plane back to Atlanta for the first time in 6 months. As the city skyline came into view from the airplane window, his heart caught in his chest, not from fear, but from awe. Titan Core's newest skyscraper, now complete, rose like a monument from the heart of the city's innovation district, a structure made not only of steel and glass, but of second chances, hard truths, and collective grit. At its base stood a plaza carefully landscaped and deliberately open to the public, where a bronze plaque shimmered in the sunlight. The words chiseled in bold serif read, "We build structures with materials, but we build legacy with people." As Ethan approached the site, he was greeted by familiar faces. Liana, now in her second year at Georgia Tech, on full scholarship, hugged him like a younger sister, welcoming an older brother home. Rashad, taller, now more confident, greeted him with a firm handshake and an easy grin. "We saved you a seat," he said. The dedication ceremony took place on a stage overlooking the plaza, where city officials, national media, construction veterans, and hundreds of Horizon trainees had gathered. Marcus took the podium first. His voice, always deliberate, carried over the crowd with a calm power. "A year ago, this company faced a decision. We could have buried a mistake, or we could have built something from it. Today you're standing on what we chose to build." He gestured behind him to the tower, then turned back to the audience. "But no structure, no matter how tall, can stand without foundation. And our foundation was forged by the courage of a man who chose humility over pride and learning over legacy." The crowd turned as Ethan was invited to the stage. He stood slowly, his legs trembling, not from nerves, but from the weight of returning. As he approached the mic, he scanned the crowd, not just for familiar faces, but for the faces of those he didn't yet know, teenagers from cities he hadn't visited, community leaders he hadn't met, construction veterans with calloused hands and proud tears in their eyes. "I spent a lot of time thinking about buildings," Ethan began, "how they rise, how they fall. How the strongest ones aren't always the tallest, but the ones with foundations that were laid with care, with patience, and with belief in what couldn't be seen." Yet he paused. "This tower isn't mine, it's yours. It belongs to every hand that touched it, every voice that challenged it, every mistake we learned from, and every silence we finally listened to." Applause followed, long, unforced, full of gratitude. But the ceremony wasn't over. Marcus stepped forward once more and turned toward the plaque. "We have one final addition," he said, and then carefully, a second bronze plate was unveiled beneath the main inscription. It read simply, "Dedicated in honor of Andre, Marcus Bradley and Ethan Cole, for reminding us that real strength is not just built, but rebuilt." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Rashad leaned toward him and whispered, "Told you, we'd make it permanent." That night, after the crowd dispersed and the plaza emptied into the quiet of evening, Ethan remained on the stage alone. The tower lights illuminated the square, casting golden reflections across the polished stone. Marcus eventually joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You stayed," he said, handing one over. Ethan nodded. "I needed a moment." Marcus sipped his coffee, then said, "You know, my father used to say the most dangerous thing a man can build is a wall between himself and the people he serves. You tore yours down." Ethan looked up at the tower. "No, we did." And for a moment, there was only silence between them, comfortable, earned, and filled with the unspoken truth that everything they had fought for, everything they had lost and rebuilt, was now etched not just in steel or concrete, but in the lives of those who would one day rise even higher. And neither of them would need to be remembered as perfect, just as the men who chose to listen to change and to build something that would never again be built on silence. Weeks after the tower dedication ceremony, the echoes of celebration had faded into the rhythm of sustained momentum, and Ethan Cole found himself once again in motion, not just traveling between cities, but navigating the emotional terrain of what it meant to lead without being needed in every room, what it meant to let go of authorship, and instead become a steward of the movement he helped ignite. Horizon was no longer an experiment or a redemption arc. It was a living network, a culture, a blueprint being replicated and reshaped by voices he had once mentored and now only observed with awe. In Houston, a former auto shop apprentice had built a Horizon workshop for single mothers re-entering the workforce. In Newark, a group of young women launched She Builds the first all-female Horizon construction module. In Minneapolis, indigenous students had integrated local building traditions into their training program, with such authenticity that national heritage boards requested collaboration. And in all of them, the common thread wasn't Ethan's name. It was his choice to step aside. Yet even with the victories piling up like steel beams on a well-run site, Ethan knew better than to get comfortable, because movements like buildings don't collapse all at once. They fracture in hairline cracks and assumptions left unexamined, in success celebrated too long without recalibration. And one such fracture was quietly forming back where it had all begun. Atlanta, it started with a call from Harold. "We've got a Horizon site falling behind schedule," he said. "Rashad's leading it, but he's not answering his check-ins." Liana's worried. Ethan's heart tightened. He hadn't spoken to Rashad in almost a month, not out of neglect, but because the man had become so capable that distance felt like trust. "I'm flying down tonight," Ethan said. "Don't tell him I'm coming." When he arrived at the Southside expansion site the next morning, the difference was palpable. The usual energy, the laughter, the synchronized drills, the music playing from a half-working speaker system was missing. The team moved like they were sleepwalking, precise but spiritless. Ethan approached a supervisor quietly. "Where's Rashad?" "He's in the trailer," the man said, avoiding eye contact. "But he's not really here." Ethan walked across the gravel, each step heavier than the last. When he opened the trailer door, he found Rashad alone, staring blankly at 3 incomplete schedules, his hard hat resting upside down on the desk. The moment Ethan entered, Rashad flinched. "Didn't know you were coming," he said flatly. Ethan didn't smile. "You okay?" Rashad hesitated, then looked down. "I don't know, I'm tired, man. Not just physically. It's like every mistake I make now. I hear their voices, the ones that said, I didn't belong here." Ethan walked closer, sat opposite him. "What happened?" Rashad rubbed his eyes. "We missed a delivery window. I didn't double-check the manifest. Liana had to call in. Backup, I messed up." Ethan shook his head. "You made a human error. That's not failure. That's leadership under pressure." Rashad slammed a fist onto the desk. "But they're watching me. Every camera, every form, every goddamn reporter waiting to write, 'Former street kid crashes Horizon site.'" His voice cracked. "I thought I was ready." Ethan's voice dropped. "You are. But being ready doesn't mean being invincible. It means being able to bend without breaking." He reached into his bag and pulled out a folded paper, an old, crinkled blueprint from their first training center. "You remember this?" Rashad nodded slowly. "We drew this on the whiteboard." Ethan placed it between them. "Look how uneven the load lines were. The overhang was wrong. You corrected it." He pointed to the corner. "This revision saved that roof from collapsing. You made that call. You didn't wait for me. You didn't need me then. And you don't need me now. But I'm here because even when you're leading, you don't have to carry it alone." Silence filled the room, heavy but healing. Then Rashad breathed deep, stood up and said, "Give me 20 minutes. I've got a team to fix." The turnaround was immediate. By noon, drills resumed. Workers found their rhythm. Liana arrived with revised load schedules. Rashad, now in a neon vest, stained with sweat and dust, led with the kind of clarity that only comes after falling and choosing to rise again. Ethan watched from the trailer window and smiled, not because things were perfect, but because they were honest again. That evening, as the site lights flickered on and the crew began to pack up, Rashad walked over and handed Ethan a sealed envelope. "This came in last week. I was going to throw it out." Ethan opened it slowly. Inside was a letter on embossed paper from Dean Wallace. "Congratulations on your expansion. We look forward to monitoring your progress closely. No threat, no support. Just presence." Ethan folded the letter, slipped it into his jacket, and said, "He's not done watching." Rashad nodded. "Let him." They stood in silence as the sun dipped behind the half-finished frame of what would soon become Atlanta's first Horizon-operated community hub. "You leaving again tomorrow?" Rashad asked. Ethan looked at him. "Only if you tell me to." Rashad smiled. Then you better go. We've got this. Ethan stepped back toward his rental car, but before opening the door, he looked back one last time at the tower, at the scaffold, at the people. And in that instant, he knew the work had never been about fixing what was broken in him. It was about creating space for others to rise on the very ground where he once fell. And now they were rising higher, stronger together. The weeks that followed Rashad's breakthrough marked a quiet but profound turning point, not just for the Atlanta Horizon site, but for the entire national program, as something subtle but unmistakable began to take hold. Maturity not just in the trainees or in Ethan himself, but in the ecosystem. They had built a sense that the movement no longer needed to prove its worth to skeptics, but only to stay true to its founding compass. Ethan returned to his national role with a new rhythm, balancing his duties across multiple states, with the grace of someone who no longer felt the need to chase every crisis, who had begun to trust the people he had once mentored to lead without his shadow hovering above. In Richmond, a Horizon alum named Tyla initiated a collaborative workshop with union journeymen to break the false binary between tradition and innovation. In Saint Louis, a young immigrant named Mateo, fluent in 3 languages and self-taught in CAD software, helped translate Horizon curriculum into Spanish and Vietnamese to better serve his community. These weren't exceptions, they were proof of concept. Horizon was working not just because of Ethan or Marcus or any single founder, but because the people who had once been excluded were now rewriting the blueprints from within. But just as the structure nears its final floor, the wind picks up. That wind came one morning in the form of a confidential email sent directly to Marcus Bradley and carbon copied to a private Titan Core legal team. The subject line: urgent federal contract, eligibility under review. Inside was a scanned preliminary report from a government oversight committee raising questions about Horizon's role in recent bid awards, specifically suggesting that its dual function as an educational platform and a labor force blurred ethical lines under federal funding guidelines. Though the accusations were vague and couched in procedural language, the intent was clear. Someone powerful wanted Horizon slowed, stalled, or silenced. Marcus forwarded the message to Ethan with a single line: "They're going higher, we have to go deeper." Ethan read the report twice, then again. "This is going to be used to disqualify us from federal contracts," he said. During the emergency video call with Marcus and Harold, "If we can't bid, we can't scale. This isn't about violations, it's about starving us out." Harold looked grim, and if the Department of Labor gets involved, our entire training pipeline could be labeled non-compliant. Marcus remained still thoughtful. "So we show them what compliance looks like when it's led by the people. Compliance was never meant to include. The plan was bold. Horizon would host a national summit, an open concept build that would become both a live construction site and an education showcase, merging public viewing with real-time training policy discussions and compliance documentation. It would be called the Foundation Project, held in Birmingham, Alabama, symbolic ground where civil rights and labor rights had always been intertwined. Ethan was appointed lead architect and coordinator. It was his most ambitious task yet. Over the next 60 days, he oversaw the transformation of an abandoned rail yard into a living classroom. Modular structures rose daily, built entirely by Horizon trainees under supervision, with every nail, every beam, every safety measure filmed, time-stamped, and published online for full transparency. Alongside the site, an exhibition space was constructed where educators, engineers, lawmakers, and workers shared stories. Innovations and visions for an industry where access and safety weren't just buzzwords, but lived realities. And in the heart of it all stood a large steel beam, etched with one phrase: "Building with nothing to hide." On opening day, the Foundation Project welcomed over 2,000 visitors. Media cameras rolled, department officials toured the site with clipboards and wide eyes. Even Dean Wallace made an appearance uninvited but expected. Ethan met him with a nod and no fear. "Welcome," he said. "You'll find everything's open here." Dean walked the site quietly, inspecting each phase, observing trainees like Rashad, now a regional instructor, teach federal inspectors how their safety drills worked, how errors were caught and corrected in real time, how leadership rotated to ensure shared responsibility. At the final panel discussion of the summit, Marcus took the stage beside Ethan and spoke to the gathered crowd. What you see here is not a loophole, it's a ladder. For every person who was told to stay in their lane, we didn't build this to skirt regulations. We built it to set a new standard. Then Ethan stepped forward. Some say we blurred lines, but all we did was draw new ones. Lines that include more people, more voices, more dignity. The applause was thunderous, and the next day, in a statement issued by the Department of Labor's Ethics Division, the ruling came down. No violations found. Horizon remains fully eligible for all public infrastructure projects. Additionally, the Foundation project is recommended as a case study for next-generation workforce integration. Ethan stood alone on the scaffold that night, long after the lights had dimmed and the crowd had dispersed, staring out over the site that had once been rusted silence and was now a monument to what could be accomplished when you invite everyone to the table. Marcus joined him quietly. "You changed everything," he said, but Ethan shook his head. "No, they did. I just stopped getting in the way." They stood side by side, not as boss and employee, not as mentor and student, but as men who had once stood on opposite sides of a silence that nearly cost them everything, and now stood on steel they had built together, unbreakable. The wind had come, but the structure stood. 6 months after the Foundation project rewrote national expectations for what construction education could look like, Horizon's growth had entered a new era. Not as a scrappy grassroots initiative fighting for legitimacy, but as an institutional force reshaping how cities, schools, unions, and governments thought about labor equity and future readiness. Across 22 states, Horizon programs now operated alongside traditional trade schools, and more often than not, outperformed them in retention innovation and post-graduation employment. Ethan Cole, once a disgraced engineer, brought to his knees by arrogance, now served as the Chief Innovation Officer of Horizon National. But in truth, he rarely spent time in the corporate headquarters. Instead, he kept his boots muddy and his flight bag packed, moving from site to site, listening more than he spoke, building bridges not just across scaffolds but across generations, industries, and histories. One morning in early spring, he returned to Atlanta for a quiet, unpublicized visit, not to inspect a site, not to deliver a speech, but to attend a ceremony being held in a small, modest amphitheater recently constructed near the East Point Horizon Center, where it all began. The ceremony was for the first class of Horizon Fellows, 25 young adults, many of whom had entered the program with little more than survival instincts, and now stood poised to enter college-managed projects and lead teams. Rashad, dressed in a fitted navy suit, stood at the podium reading the names, and each one was greeted not just with applause but with tears, laughter, and the echoes of hammer strikes and chalkboard scribbles from the months of work that led to this day. Liana, now a published design contributor in Architectural Digest and newly accepted into Columbia's urban design program, delivered the keynote. "The world will ask you to prove you belong," she said, her voice steady. "But we've already proven that the world is better because we're in it. So don't just build design what never existed before you arrived." Ethan sat in the back row, head bowed, listening, letting the emotion pool in his chest, like concrete being poured to seal the final layer of a foundation, years in the making. After the ceremony, Rashad found him. "You really came?" he said, not surprised, but genuinely moved. Ethan smiled. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." They walked together along the pathway that wound through the campus, now expanded to include dorm-style housing, collaborative labs, a food garden maintained by trainees, and a newly installed bronze statue at the entrance. It depicted a pair of hands not smooth and decorative but rough-weathered, cracked with labor, holding up a beam inscribed with the words, "Respect is the strongest material." Rashad paused beside it. "We've had visitors from South Africa, Brazil, even Japan. They want to build their own horizons." Ethan looked at him, proud but grounded. "Then help them. Just remember, it's not the structure that matters, it's the people who hold it up." That evening, Marcus hosted a quiet dinner at his home, a modest book-filled space not far from the original Titan Core headquarters. Around the table sat people who had once been strangers, site foremen, former trainees, youth counselors, architects, and engineers. And in the corner, resting on a shelf above Marcus's fireplace, sat a framed photo of a younger Marcus in a dusty work shirt, standing beside a teenage Ethan, taken just days after the incident that started it all. Ethan walked over, staring at it for a long time. "I almost destroyed everything that mattered because I thought being right was the same as being better," he said quietly. Marcus joined him. And I almost stayed silent because I thought being wrong once meant I didn't have the right to speak again. Ethan turned to him. You ever think about how close we came to missing this? Marcus nodded. Every day. And that's why we protect it. Not with control, but with care. That night after the guests had left and the city lights flickered like distant sparks on the horizon, Ethan stood alone beneath the tower that bore no plaque with his name, no statue in his honor, only a heartbeat built into its structure. Because in the end, his greatest legacy would never be a title or a building. It would be the echo of a young man's voice teaching safety to a room full of strangers. The sight of a girl from East Point drawing load diagrams on a napkin while waiting for a bus. The feeling in a father's chest when his son, once told he'd never amount to anything, walked through a door carrying blueprints he designed with his own hands. Horizon had started as a mistake made visible, but it had become a promise made permanent. And as Ethan looked up at the steel lines cutting into the night sky, he whispered the words that had once been spoken to him, now passed on, not just to one, but to thousands. You belong, not because someone said so, but because you're already building the world we were all waiting for. And somewhere in that silence, he knew the foundation would hold. Always. What started with a single moment of humiliation became a movement that rewrote the rules of an entire industry. Ethan Cole thought he was teaching others how to build, but he had to be broken first to understand what true construction really means. And Marcus Bradley. He didn't seek revenge. He built a legacy one, where every overlooked voice became a pillar, every ignored idea became a foundation, and every dismissed life found its place in the skyline. Horizon wasn't just a program. It became a symbol for what's possible when we replace arrogance with humility, exclusion with access, and fear with courage. Because buildings don't last unless they're built, right? And people, they don't rise unless someone believes in what's buried beneath. So, to every worker who's been underestimated, to every dream that's been deferred, and to every voice that's been silenced, we see you, we hear you, and we're building a future with you. One beam, one brick, one brave story at a time. If this story moved you, like, share and subscribe, because we're not done building. We're just getting started.